right, I'm back. And yeah, it's almost like I never even left. I hate it. You love it. It's time to update the top 25 heading into week 11. God darn. Boy, this thing goes by quick every year, doesn't it? The good news is it might not seem like it. We've got 3 months of football left. We got all of November. In December, we're going to have conference championship games, first round playoff games, bowl games. New Year's Eve and New Year's Day around there is going to be the second round playoff games. Into January, the first couple of weeks of January, we'll have the Final Four playoff games, the semifinals, and then of course January 20th, the national championship. So still a ton of football left to go, but heading into week 11 and things starting to shake themselves out here. So it is time to update the top 25. I'm going to show it to you now. There it is. All right. Get your typing fingers ready for the arguments in the comment section. I left Oregon at 1. That's the same as last week. I saw no reason to move them down. They absolutely dominated again, this time on the road at Michigan. I know Michigan's not a great team this year, especially compared to last year, 15-0 national champions. But what else do you want Oregon to do? They go in there, they play them there. They absolutely dominate the game from start to finish. Now, they did lose wide receiver Tez Johnson, and, that's never good. We hate to see anybody get hurt, so they're going to have to find somebody to step up there at the wide receiver position, but they're loaded with talent. They took care of business. They improved to 9-0. They're hosting Maryland this coming weekend. It looks like Oregon headed for a 12-0 season and a trip to the Big Ten title game. At number 2, I moved Ohio State up. I had them at 4 last week, moved them up to 2. They went on the road and beat Penn State. You can talk to me till you're blue in the face about, this is the same Penn State team as every single year. Yeah, that's right. A top 15 team. That's what Penn State is every single year. A 10-plus win team, likely to go 11-1 this year. Penn State's probably going to make the playoffs. I don't know how mad that makes you, but they look like they're headed for 11-1. Now, that doesn't excuse the disappointing performance they had Saturday, especially offensively against Ohio State, but the reality is what it is. They're going to be 11-1 most likely with a 7-point loss to a really good Ohio State team. So I think Ohio State going in there and getting the job done. I moved them up a couple of spots. Miami won big. Ohio State hosts Purdue this weekend, by the way, which I think they're a 1-win team. So a nothing burger there for Penn State. At number 3, I've got Miami. I had them at number 3 last week. I just left them there. If you're wondering why jump Ohio State over Miami, Miami's undefeated. Ohio State's got the loss. Ohio State does have a loss, but it's a 1-point loss on the road at the number 1 team in the country. And yes, Miami is undefeated, but they haven't played exactly the toughest of schedules, and their defense continues to give up a ton of points. I don't know if Miami fans are going to take this as a compliment or an insult, but Miami right now is starting to remind me a lot of the Lincoln Riley Oklahoma teams. One of, if not the best offenses in the country. Stop me when this sounds familiar. One of, if not the best offenses in the country, a Heisman candidate and possible Heisman winner at the quarterback position, and a defense that gives up way too many yards and way too many points, and you just can't count on or rely on. That's kind of what Miami is right now. Now, Miami will win a lot of games with that. It's like Oklahoma did. Oklahoma, of course, never made it out of the first round of the playoffs with that sort of recipe. Now, we have a 12-team playoff now, so the matchups aren't exactly the same. We'll see what Miami can do, but Miami's undefeated. I'm not punishing Miami. I mean, I left them at 3. But Ohio State, honestly, Ohio State losing to Oregon by 1 and beating Penn State by 7, both of those things to me are more impressive than any opponent Miami has played. That's not Miami's fault. Miami plays who's on their schedule, right? That's all they can do. And I've got Miami in the top 3 now. So whether or not the Miami fans choose to get upset about that is on them. But Miami, like Oregon, it appears to me is headed for a 12-0 regular season and a trip in the to the ACC championship game, where of course a win would guarantee them a playoff spot. They play on the road at Georgia Tech this year or this coming week. So again, they'll be a significant favorite. At number 4, I've got Georgia. That's down 2 from last week. This is a combination of things here. Number 1, it's Ohio State going on the road and winning against a top 5 team in Penn State. You have to reward that. Number 2, another lackluster performance by Georgia, particularly on the offensive side of the ball, mainly Carson Beck. Another 3 interceptions, another 3 turnover game for Carson Beck. Now, Georgia wins by 14. They were favored by 14.5. They won by 14. So, I mean, it is what it is in terms of the score, but the reality is Georgia's a way better team than Florida. They're way more talented. They have a way better roster. They're way better coached. They're in a way better position right now than Florida is. That game should not have been as close as it was in the second half. It just shouldn't. And even worse, really, is sort of the continued turnover problem that Carson Beck continues to show week after week. Georgia's good enough, apparently, to commit a bunch of turnovers and win on the road at Texas. Carson Beck had 3 turnovers there. Win in a neutral site against Florida, another 3 turnovers for Carson Beck. Georgia is not good enough, nor is any team, I don't think, once you get into December and January, to turn the ball over 3 or 4 times and beat anybody at all. I don't care who you're getting matched up with in the playoffs. Turn the ball over 3 or 4 times, you're likely to lose. Top of that, for Georgia, they still have 2 games against ranked opponents coming up on the schedule. They play this week on the road at Ole Miss. Ole Miss looked really good this past weekend, especially offensively. They put up a ton of yards and points against Arkansas. And then, of course, the week after that, they host Tennessee. So if Carson Beck turns the ball over like he has been, Georgia's not winning both of those games. And Georgia's got to win out if they want to make the SEC championship game. Now, I think Georgia would still get into the playoffs at 10-2, so they could drop 1 game, I think, and still get into the playoffs because they'd have a couple of pretty good wins over teams like Clemson and Texas. And if they only lose 1 more game during the regular season, that would mean that they beat either Ole Miss or Tennessee. So they would have a lot of ranked wins against quality opponents, some of which would be on the road. So I think a 10-2 Georgia would still get it in the playoffs. But if Carson Beck keeps turnovers going, they're not going to the SEC championship game. They'll drop a regular season game somewhere. And if they do get in the playoffs, they're not going to win it with that kind of turnover issue. So they got to get that cleaned up. I moved them down to 4. At number 5, I've got Indiana. I'm kind of just tired of inching Indiana up bit by bit. One of the complaints that everybody has about polls and rankings, particularly the polls and rankings like mine or the AP or the coaches or whatever that come out in the preseason, is that teams that start the season ranked high have an inherent advantage over teams that start the season unranked or ranked low. And that's true. I can't even argue against that. I mean, you know, look at some of these teams in my top 10. They've got losses. Some of the teams in my top 20 have 2 losses. Whereas Indiana has blown out just about everybody they've played. They've looked like one of the best teams in the country every single week of the year. They've got no losses. But yet, even in the AP, they just now broke into the top 10 of the AP at number 8. Now, I had them in the top 10 last week at number 9. But the reason they were number 9 and not number 5 is only because they were unranked at the start of the season. I admit it. It is a problem with polls and rankings when you start with a preseason bias. And really that's what you're doing when you do like I do and like everybody else does, and you make polls in the preseason and then you adjust your polls week by week throughout the season. It is a disadvantage to teams like Indiana. So instead of continuing to move them up 1 spot or whatever every time they beat somebody, I decided to kind of just make a correction based on that. Indiana has looked like a top 10 team. They just have. Now, they get a shot against Ohio State in a couple of weeks, and maybe they go to Columbus and lose by 40. I don't know, in which case, of course, we'll have to drop them way down. But they look really good to me. So I've moved them all the way up to 5, ahead of Texas, who has a loss, Tennessee, who has a loss, Penn State, who has a loss, and Notre Dame, who has a loss. BYU, I've got at 8. So I've got Indiana at 5. They won again this past week. They beat Michigan State 47-10. And this coming week, they play Michigan. So, you're going to say, well, Michigan's terrible. Well, Michigan is Michigan. You know, in any random year, Michigan should beat Indiana. Not likely to happen this year. I think Indiana's a legitimate team, and I'm excited to watch them get a shot against Ohio State here in a couple of weeks. I've got Texas at 6. They came off of a bye week, so no game for them this past week. They were at 6 last week in my ranking, so I just left them the same. Same thing with Tennessee. Didn't move them up or down. Texas plays Florida this week at home, so Florida got to travel out to Austin to take on the Longhorns. We'll see if Texas can get it done against the Gators. Tennessee, I left at 7. They beat Kentucky. Same kind of story for Tennessee. They're a really good team. They've got good lines of scrimmage, particularly on defense. They run the ball really well. They've got probably the best running back in the SEC in Dylan Sampson, and they play really good defense. they struggle to throw the ball. It's weird to see because normally Josh Heupel Tennessee teams is something they excel at. They've had some really good wide receivers. They've had some pretty good QBs. The passing game has been what it's been at Tennessee, but for whatever reason this year, it just looks a little off. And it's easy to kind of point the finger at Nico because he got all the offseason hype and attention. And while it's true he hasn't played great, he's missed some throws, some overthrows. I think he holds the ball a little long sometimes and takes sacks. Maybe he shouldn't. But it's the receivers, too. They're dropping passes there at Tennessee. There's just some things going on with the passing game you're not used to seeing. But they have a really good defense, maybe the best in the SEC. They've got maybe the best running back in the SEC. They really remind me of a lot of Kirby Smart's early Georgia teams that were built very similar to that. The 2017 team in particular comes to mind under Kirby. Really good defense. Could run the ball really good. They had, of course, Nick Chubb and Sony Michel running the ball. Jake Fromm at quarterback and a bunch of wide receivers that no one can name anymore because they couldn't really throw the ball that well. And that's kind of what Tennessee reminds me of. They're a really good team. I said all year long, I think Tennessee on their best day is capable of competing and potentially beating anybody in the country. I know they took a loss to Arkansas, but look around. A lot of teams have either struggled or lost this year to teams they probably shouldn't have. Tennessee's a really good team, has a chance to play for the SEC championship if they can get through Georgia in a couple of weeks. We'll see. I've got them at number 7. They host Mississippi State this coming week. I've got BYU at 8. They were off this week. They're, of course, still undefeated. Got the Holy War coming up there. Is that what they're calling that? BYU on the road at Utah. Looked like a really good game in the preseason and even the first couple of weeks of the season. But, of course, Utah has just fallen off the face of the earth. Cam Rising injured again. Maybe coming back next year for an 8th year. I don't know. But Utah is just, they're a shell of what we thought they would be. BYU should be able to go in there and win that game. Now, it can be tough to play there, and that's a rivalry game, so we'll see. But BYU remains undefeated. I've got them at 8. That's up 2 spots for me from last week. I moved Penn State down to 9. I had them at 5 last week. They they host Ohio State and lose by a touchdown. And again, I've talked about this game a ton, both on Saturday, yesterday on the Your Season Is Over video. Talked about it a little bit a few minutes ago when I mentioned Ohio State. Penn State's a good team. They're probably a legitimate top 10 team, top 15 at the worst. They've got a really good defense. They've got 2 running backs that are really good, although I don't know what happened to them on Saturday. They were nowhere to be found. Penn State's 2 leading rushers were its tight end and its quarterback. No explosive plays, 0 offensive touchdowns for Penn State. Just unacceptable performance for Penn State. No question, no doubt about it. James Franklin deserves 100% of the criticism he's receiving right now. But I moved them down to 9. The end of the day, no matter how much talking we want to do about different things, they lost by 7 to a top 5 team. And that's their only loss so far. I dropped them down. I dropped them down to number 9. I had them at 5 last week. They host Washington this coming week. Notre Dame moves into my top 10 this week. That's up 1 spot from last week. Notre Dame was on a bye. They host Florida State this week. So they'll, win. It's a name your number game. Notre Dame might beat them by 30 or 40. I don't know. They'll blow them out for sure. At number 11, I've got Alabama. That's up 3 spots from last week. Now, Alabama didn't play. This is just teams around them losing, right? Iowa State, who was undefeated and ranked ahead of Bama, lost. Clemson, who had 1 loss and was ranked ahead of Bama, lost. Texas A&M, who was ranked ahead of Bama, with 1 loss, lost. So it was just teams around them losing. So it's nothing Alabama did. They were on a bye week. They'll get a chance to prove themselves this week. They travel to play LSU in one of the biggest games of the week. It's an elimination game in every sense of the term. Both of those teams are sitting on 2 losses. The loser of this game is out of not only the SEC championship game, but in all likelihood will not make the playoffs. So this is a massive game this week, and you can see I've got LSU at 12. They were also off this past week. So both teams have had an extra week to sort of get some injured players healed up, extra week of practice, the whole thing that goes into that with the bye week. And this is going to be a massive game this Saturday night. Alabama on the road at LSU. I've got them at 11-12. One team will be moving up. One team will be moving down in next week's top 25. I've got Boise State at 13. That's also up a couple of spots from last week. They won again. They beat San Diego State 56-24. They play Nevada this coming week. Albert Jentsmith had about 150 yards to running back for Boise State. Albert Jentsmith. SMU at 14. Moved him up a couple of spots. Had him at 20. Absolutely destroyed an undefeated Pitt team at home this past weekend. I mean, this game was never in question and never in doubt. 48-25. SMU jumped on them early, and it was over quick, fast, and in a hurry. And they appear, to me anyway, to be headed to the ACC title game in their first year in the ACC, which is a massive, massive failure for Clemson. People keep there's a lot of talk right now about Clemson losing to Louisville. And yeah, that was bad. Clemson lost at home to Louisville. The game wasn't competitive. Louisville was clearly better, more prepared, better coached. It was bad. But what people are missing is the fact that SMU also won and beat Pitt. They're likely headed to the ACC championship game to play Miami, not Clemson, not Florida State. SMU and Miami. If that happens, somebody's winning the ACC that's never won it before. SMU, of course, has never won it before because this is their first year in the ACC. Miami's never won the ACC before because they're complete hot fucking garbage for the entire 20-year history of them being in the ACC. So we'll see. But I've got SMU at 14. They're off. They have a bye this coming week. I've got Ole Miss at 15. Moved them up. Sorry. Had them at 21. Moved them up to 15. Good to see the Ole Miss offense back again. We haven't seen it since September. Ole Miss offense pretty much took the month of October off, took a couple of losses. But they looked really good this past Saturday. And, of course, they're going to get a chance to prove whether or not they're a playoff-worthy team this coming Saturday when they host Georgia. Ole Miss is sitting on 2 losses. They've got to win that game or their playoff dreams are out the window. We'll see. It should be a good one. Georgia's favored by just 2.5 points in that game right now, so they're expecting a close one. I've got Ole Miss at 15. Iowa State, I dropped down to 16. I had them at 13. I don't know where everybody else had them. I might have been a little low on them last week compared to other rankings. They lost. I dropped them down to 16. It was a close loss, but it was a close loss to a team that I don't think is very good. I know Texas Tech is 6-3, but they've lost to teams like Baylor, who's not any good. They didn't get blown out. Close loss. It was whoever has the ball last type of thing is going to win the game. And unfortunately for Iowa State, it wasn't them. Texas Tech ends up getting the win 23-22. Iowa State plays on the road at Kansas this week. I got Texas A&M at 17 after getting absolutely monkey stomped by South Carolina Saturday night in Columbia at Williams-Brice Stadium. Another game that was just an absolute massacre. Tied in the second half, 20-20. And then Carolina just took off with it, never looked back. 44-20. Texas A&M falls to South Carolina. They're off this coming week, and good timing for that. They need an off week. I've got Army at 18. They beat Air Force 20-3 this past week. Didn't play great, but they got the win. They're on the road at North Texas this coming week. They remain undefeated. Showdown with Notre Dame looming here in a couple of weeks for Army. I've got Washington State all the way up at 19. I had them ranked last week at 22. They still have just the one loss. Now, they were off. They didn't play, but again, it's teams around them losing, so you have to shuffle them up a little. Well, you don't have to, but I did. Shuffled them up a little bit. Got them at 19 now, Washington State, and they play Utah State this coming week. Pitt, I've got at 20th after taking their first loss of the season. Got absolutely obliterated on the road by SMU. They just weren't ready for that game, obviously, and SMU rolled all over them. But that is Pitt's first loss. They still get to play Clemson. They have a chance still to make the ACC title game, but they're going to need SMU to lose a couple of games or Miami to lose a game and just some weird things to happen. So it could technically still happen for them and Clemson both, although I don't see it happening. I think we're headed for an SMU-Miami showdown in the ACC championship game. I've got Pitt at 20. They host Virginia this week. Louisville, 21 after beating Clemson this week, 33-21. The game wasn't even that close. Louisville dominated that game from start to finish. They're on a bye this coming week. Clemson right behind Louisville at 22. I'm not sure what the AP or the coaches did with Clemson. They're probably a little higher, I would imagine, on Clemson than this. But a lot has been made of Clemson's schedule over the last 2 months since they played Georgia. It really was a string of terrible teams. Now, I didn't hold that against Clemson. Clemson can't help how good or bad a team is that they play. But, we saw Clemson play a top 10 team in week 1 and get blown out. They then played a string of absolute nobodies and blew them out. So he said, okay, what does that mean? Well, it might mean that they're not very good because Clemson or Louisville came in there and pushed them around. Turns out Oob Doob might not have been Root. Not sure on that, but I've got Clemson at 22. They still have to play on the road at Virginia Tech, on the road at Pitt, and they host South Carolina. This week, they're on the road at Virginia Tech, so we'll see if they can get it turned around. Vandy. Move Vandy up to 23. They won again, beat Auburn, their first ever win at Auburn. Now, they have a ton of wins over Auburn, but not in Auburn. They used to play other places, so it's not the first time they beat Auburn, but it's not even the first time they beat Auburn on the road. But it's the first time they've beat Auburn in Auburn. You'd have to go pull up the Wikipedia page, and it shows you where all the games were played. But for a long time, they didn't play the games in Auburn for whatever reason. But anyway, 17-7, Vandy gets to win on the road at Auburn. They play South Carolina this coming week. Going to be an interesting game. They get to host South Carolina. South Carolina coming off their biggest win of the year. A lot of times it's hard for a team like that to turn around and give a good performance again the next week. And if South Carolina shows up at Vanderbilt not ready to play, Vanderbilt will beat them too. Shout out to their quarterback, Diego Poverty. He's having a hell of a year. South Carolina's quarterback, Steve Urkel, had a great game this past weekend too, so we'll see. But Vandy hosts South Carolina this coming week, who, as you can see, cracks my top 25 at number 25. And if we're being real, I don't do power ratings, but if we're being honest about how many of these teams on this list could South Carolina beat, or if you just wanted to do a ranking of the actual best teams, which is not what my top 25 is. This is a combination of where I think a team deserves to be ranked based on what they've done, combined with what I feel about the team or my opinion of the team. It's a kind of a combination. South Carolina 6-3, I believe. Is that right? I think they're about 6. I think that's right, 6-3. The LSU game, they should have won that game. The referees literally robbed South Carolina of that LSU game at home. That could have been another win. Alabama came down on onside kick. Now, I know you can't go back and say that because that's always the case. Every team that's got losses has close losses. You don't just get to go back and say, well, if it would have this or that. So I'm not saying that, but the point is there's a lot of teams in this top 25 that I think South Carolina could beat. But the reality is they do have the 3 losses, so I've got them ranked 25th. But they are in the poll. They are in the ranking at 25, and you can see I've got Colorado at 24. They were on a bye this week. They play on the road at Texas Tech this coming week. Colorado still just has 2 losses. They lost to Nebraska, and they lost to Kansas State. Kansas State took another loss this past weekend. Not good for Kansas State. Looks like they will not be playing in the Big 12 title game. But Colorado might. It's down really to BYU, Iowa State. Kansas State, I think, still technically has a chance, but a lot would have to happen. So basically, it's BYU, Iowa State, Colorado, and Kansas State. 2 of those 4 teams are going to play. It looks like it's probably going to be Iowa State and BYU, but we'll see. Colorado hanging around with just 1 conference loss right now. All right, there you go. That's my top 25. Be sure and let me know down below how wrong I am. Have a good morning.